a Maiasaura mother could not afford a single mistake. One misstep and her entire clutch of 25 eggs would be dead. At Egg Mountain in Montana, paleontologists discovered the fossilized remains of a nursery so precise it looked like a battlefield manual. 7 meters between nests, no closer. Eggs buried in vegetation that had to decompose at the exact right rate to hit 33 degrees Celsius. The mother fasted for 8 straight weeks, losing nearly half her body weight. She never left the nest for more than 90 minutes. If she did, the predators won. The Cretaceous was the most dangerous time to be a mother, and the rules were absolute. This was not instinct. This was a survival code written in bone. In the summer of 1978, 2 paleontologists walked into a vast hillside near Choteau, Montana, and found something that should not have existed. Jack Horner and Bob Makela had discovered an ancient nursery, a 2-square-mile expanse of fossilized nests piled on top of one another, generation after generation, all dating back 77 million years. Among the bones were adult skeletons, juveniles, hatchlings, and clusters of eggs still resting in the bowls of their mounds. It was the first time scientists found direct physical evidence that dinosaurs were not just egg layers, they were mothers. Horner gave the creature a name that would reset the public imagination: Maiasaura, Greek for caring mother lizard. The site was called Egg Mountain, and what it revealed upended everything we thought we knew about the Cretaceous world. The old image of swamp-bound monsters abandoning their young to chance was wrong. In its place was a portrait of colonial parenting so disciplined that modern birds look like amateurs. But the real questions were darker. Why did the rules have to be so punishingly exact? What happened when a mother failed? And if these creatures were so devoted, how did their entire species vanish in an instant? The answers lie in a code written in their bones, a code we are only now beginning to decipher. The moment Jack Horner and Bob Makela realized what they had found, they stopped speaking. They had been walking across a remote hillside in western Montana, picking at what looked like fragments of duck-billed dinosaur bone, when they noticed something strange. The ground was not just littered with bones. It was layered with them. Entire nests, one on top of the other, compressed by time into a cross-section of ancient catastrophe and devotion. The soil was a mass grave of tiny hatchlings, broken eggshells, and the skeletal remains of mothers. This was not a random scattering of fossils. This was a deliberate, repeated pattern of behavior that stretched across thousands of years. The dinosaurs had been coming back to this exact spot season after season, generation after generation, to lay their eggs and fight to keep them alive. And the evidence suggested they had been losing that fight more often than they won. The creature responsible for these nests was not a monster from a nightmare. Maiasaura was a hadrosaur, a duck-billed herbivore that grew to about 30 feet long and weighed upward of 3 tons. She walked on 4 legs but could rise on 2, scanning the horizon for threats. Her face was long and horse-like, with a beak in front and hundreds of tightly packed teeth in the back, perfect for grinding tough Cretaceous vegetation. But her most remarkable features were not her teeth or her size. They were her nesting habits, preserved in shocking detail at Egg Mountain and across 60 other known sites, stretching from Montana into Canada. Maiasaura mothers did not simply dig a hole and walk away. They constructed elaborate mound nests 6 or 7 feet wide, using soil and carefully selected plant material. They placed their eggs, up to 25 of them, in specific arrangements. And then they began the most grueling maternal marathon in the history of life on Earth. The central hill of Egg Mountain, as it became known, held the key to understanding the impossible mathematics of Cretaceous motherhood. The nests were not scattered randomly. They were spaced precisely. Measurements across the site revealed a regular interval of about 23 feet between nests, just over 7 meters. That number was not an accident. Every mother understood, at an instinctual level so deep it bordered on genetic law, that if she built her nest 1 foot closer to her neighbor, disaster would follow. The colony needed to be tight enough to provide shared protection from predators. But too close, and the mothers would fight. Too close, and the sheer volume of eggs would attract every scavenger within miles. Too close, and a single predator strike could wipe out multiple clutches at once. The 7-meter rule was a razor's edge between community and catastrophe. But here is what makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The Maiasaura mothers were not just defending against predators, they were fighting physics itself. A dinosaur egg cannot simply sit in the sun and incubate like a modern reptile's. The Cretaceous climate in what is now Montana was warm but unstable, with seasonal temperature swings that could drop below freezing at night. To keep her eggs alive, the mother had to turn her nest into a biological furnace. She gathered vegetation, ferns, conifer branches, rotting wood, and packed it into the mound. As the organic matter decayed, microbes went to work generating heat. The target temperature inside that mound was 33 degrees Celsius, roughly 91 degrees Fahrenheit. If the pile was too wet, it would grow mold. Too dry, and the heat would spike and cook the embryos. The mother monitored this invisible furnace with her body, pressing her sensitive snout against the mound material constantly, adjusting, adding, removing. One mistake in the first week, and every egg would rot. The work was relentless. The eggs had to be turned multiple times a day to ensure even heating. The mother used her broad, flat feet to gently roll them, never breaking the shell, never cracking the fragile life inside. She did this in the dark, in the cold, while her own body screamed for food, because the most brutal rule of all was the fast. For the entire 8 weeks of incubation, the Maiasaura mother did not leave the nest long enough to feed herself. She could not. The nest could not be unattended for more than 90 minutes. Anything longer, and a passing crew daunted, a small, intelligent predator with grasping hands could dart in and ravage the clutch. So the mother starved. Research on the fossilized bone tissue of adult Maiasaura found at nest sites shows severe stress lines, signs of massive calcium depletion, and evidence that mothers lost up to 40% of their body weight during a single nesting season. They were already 3-ton animals, but by the time the eggs hatched, they were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and at the edge of survival. Some of them never recovered. The colony was a pressure cooker of territorial tension. Any juvenile that wandered into the wrong nest zone was not welcomed. It was killed. Fossil evidence suggests that mothers could recognize their own offspring, likely by scent, and they would brutally attack any unrelated young that got too close. Competition for the limited vegetation around the colony was fierce, and every mother knew that her own babies needed every possible calorie. There was no room for generosity. The nests themselves show signs of frantic repairs after storms, floods, and small predators. The mother slept with part of her body draped over the mound, her massive tail curled around the perimeter, her head resting on the rim. She was a living shield. And then, after 8 weeks of starvation, of turning eggs, of fighting off predators and neighbors and exhaustion, the moment arrived. The eggs pipped. Tiny snouts broke through the shells, and a chorus of weak cheeping sounds filled the colony. The mother had succeeded, but her work had only just begun. Because the hatchlings were helpless. Their legs were not developed enough to walk. Their teeth showed microscopic wear patterns that proved they could not forage on their own. They were completely dependent on their mother to bring them food, to protect them, to teach them. And she was now at her weakest point, a 3-ton skeleton held together by instinct. Not every Cretaceous mother followed the Maiasaura playbook. About 2,000 miles south of Egg Mountain, in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia, another species was writing its own brutal maternal code. In 1993, a team of paleontologists unearthed a fossil that made the world gasp. It was an oviraptorid, a theropod dinosaur related to the velociraptors of pop culture, about the size of an ostrich. It had a beak, a bony crest on its head, and long arms covered in feathers. But what made this specimen famous was its position. It was sitting on a circular nest of at least 22 eggs, arranged in concentric rings. Its arms were spread wide, draped over the clutch, exactly like a modern chicken brooding her eggs. Its tail was wrapped around the nest edge. Its body was hunched forward, the head turned to one side, as if it had died watching for danger. The animal was not just fossilized, it was frozen in the ultimate act of maternal sacrifice. That specimen was named Siddipati, and it taught us that the Cretaceous was filled with mothers dying for their children. Siddipati mothers did not rely on rotting vegetation for incubation. They used their own body heat, just as birds do today. Their feathers were not for flight, they were insulation, a living blanket trapping warmth against the eggs. And just like the Maiasaura, they did not eat. They did not drink. They did not leave. They brooded through storms, through heat waves, through the endless nights of a world lit only by volcanic glows and distant auroras. When a sandstorm hit the nest, as one did in the Gobi specimen, it buried the mother alive. She did not run, she stayed. And the fossil tells us she died right there, wings outstretched, covering her unborn children, until the last grain of sand filled her lungs. But even that utter devotion was not always enough. At Egg Mountain, paleontologists found entire nest layers that told a different story. Some mounds were crushed, the eggs shattered, the tiny bones of hatchlings scattered across yards of sediment. Predation marks were visible on the shells. In other cases, the eggs were intact, but the embryos inside had died, a sign of temperature failure. And in the most haunting discoveries, they found mothers themselves, their adult skeletons still curled around their nests, dead in the brooding position. The Cretaceous was not a gentle nursery. It was a machine that chewed up even the most devoted parents. This is the central question that drives everything that follows. If Maiasaura and Siddipati were so perfectly adapted to motherhood, if their behaviors were so precise and so demanding that they bordered on torture, why did they vanish? What broke the code? The answer lies not in a single moment of failure, but in a cascade of pressures that escalated beyond anything the Cretaceous mothers could endure. And the first sign of that breaking point is written in a layer of rock at the very top of Egg Mountain, a layer where the nests suddenly vanish. Not a single egg, not a single hatchling, just silence. But before we reach that silence, we have to understand exactly what a day in the life of a Maiasaura mother looked like. Because when you see the full brutality of her schedule, you will realize that extinction was not an event. It was a daily threat she held at bay with nothing but her body and her will. And one day the math simply stopped working. Dawn arrived at Egg Mountain like a wet blanket. Humidity from the western interior seaway rolled across the nesting grounds, condensing on the backs of 50 sleeping Maiasaura mothers. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of rain. The mother at nest 43 had been motionless for 4 hours, her massive body draped across the mound, her tail curled tight against her flanks, her head resting on the rim of packed earth. Her breathing was shallow, ribs visible beneath loose skin that had once been taut. She had not eaten in 37 days. Her stomach was empty, her muscles consuming themselves, and she could not afford to move. The temperature inside the mound was her entire universe. She could feel it through the sensitive skin of her snout, the faint warmth radiating upward through layers of decaying fern and conifer needle. 33 degrees Celsius. If it held, the embryos inside the 21 eggs arrayed beneath her would continue their silent development. If it dropped, even by 2 degrees, the hatchlings would emerge weak, their bones underdeveloped, their lungs too fragile to take a first breath. If it spiked, the proteins inside the eggs would denature, and she would be sitting on a mound of scrambled death. She did not know these numbers the way a scientist does. She knew them the way a heartbeat knows its rhythm. Every mother in the colony had inherited this knowledge across 60 million years of trial and error, written not in books but in the neural architecture of her brainstem. She lifted her head slowly, scanning the colony. Through the gray dawn light, she could see the other mounds, spaced at the sacred distance of 7 meters, each with its own emaciated guardian. Nest 12 had a mother who was younger, still carrying some of the weight she had put on during the wet season. Nest 27 belonged to an older female, her back scarred from a troodontid attack 2 seasons ago, her left eye clouded and useless. Nest 31 had been abandoned 3 days ago. The mother had left to drink from a distant stream, and she had not returned. Whether she had fallen to a predator or simply collapsed from exhaustion, no one in the colony would ever know. Her eggs were cold now, the embryos dead, the mound already beginning to sag as the vegetation lost its heat. By tomorrow, scavengers would find it. The mother at nest 43 could not think about the abandoned nest. She had her own work to do. She rose slowly, her leg muscles screaming in protest. For the first time in 6 hours, she stood fully upright, her 3-ton body casting a long shadow across the mound. The eggs needed turning. She extended her right foot, the broad, padded sole cradling the first egg with a gentleness that belied her size. She rolled it, then the next, and the next. The motion was mechanical, ingrained, her brain counting automatically. 1, 2, 3. She would repeat this ritual 3 times today, just as she had done every day for the past 5 weeks. Each egg had to receive equal warmth. Any embryo pressed against the shell wall for too long would stick, its delicate membrane fusing to the inner surface, and it would die. The mother did not know this in words, but she knew it in the pit of her empty stomach. By the time she finished the first rotation of the day, the sun was fully up, and the colony had come alive with sound. Dozens of mothers shifted on their mounds, the air filled with low rumbling calls, contact signals between neighbors, warnings to any juvenile wandering too close. A group of yearlings had emerged from the scrub forest to the east, hungry and curious. They were not the offspring of any mother currently nesting. They were survivors of the previous season's hatch, now half-grown and fending for themselves. And they were a threat. The mother at nest 43 spotted them immediately. Her body stiffened. She lowered her head and let out a guttural hiss, a sound that vibrated through the ground. The yearlings froze, recognized the warning, and veered away. Had they come closer, she would have charged. Other mothers had already done so in past seasons, trampling unrelated juveniles to death without hesitation. The colony had no room for sentiment. Every calorie of vegetation within a 2-mile radius was spoken for. Every nest was a fortress. The morning wore on. The temperature rose. The mother checked her mound repeatedly, pressing her snout into the decomposing vegetation, sniffing, probing. She could detect the ammonia-like tang of microbial activity, the sweet smell of healthy decay. Everything was holding, but she was fading. Her body had consumed nearly all of its fat reserves. Her muscles were beginning to break down. The fast was not a choice. It was a biological mandate. She could not leave the nest for more than a handful of minutes. The stream that provided water was a quarter of a mile away, and a round trip took at least 40 minutes at the slow, weak pace she could now manage. If she went, a troodontid could strike. The little predator was fast, clever, and always watching. It knew the colony's rhythms. It knew when a mother was distracted. So she did not drink. She obtained what moisture she could from licking dew off the ferns near her nest. It was hardly enough. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. The colony baked under a Cretaceous sun that burned through the hazy atmosphere. The mother panted, her massive chest heaving. Her tongue lolled from her beak-like mouth. The mound's temperature was rising, the decay accelerating. She scraped away some of the insulating vegetation, using her forelimbs to thin the blanket, letting excess heat escape. If she removed too much, the night cold would kill the embryos. Too little, and they would cook. The margin of error was vanishingly small. She had been a mother for 8 seasons now. Her first nest, when she was 7 years old, had been a disaster. She had chosen a site too close to the colony edge. A flash flood had come in the second week, inundating her mound, turning the eggs to mud. She had stood in the rain, screaming into the storm, her calls echoing across the valley. The second season, a pack of troodontids had overwhelmed her at dusk. She had fought, killing one with a swing of her tail, but 2 others had snatched eggs from the edge of the clutch before she could drive them off. Half the nest had been lost. The third season, a bacterial infection had spread through the colony, turning the eggs black and soft. She had watched her entire clutch dissolve over the course of a week, unable to do anything but press her snout against the failing shells and make sounds that no healthy Maiasaura ever made. But she had learned. With each failure, her instincts refined. She watched the successful mothers, the old matriarchs who raised 20 hatchlings year after year. She observed their patterns, their nest placements, their responses to predators, and she adapted. By her 5th season, she had successfully fledged a clutch of 18. The 6th season, 22. She had become one of the reliable mothers, the ones whose young survived to join the juvenile herds. And that reliability had made her a target. Older females often fought for the best nesting sites, the elevated mounds that drained well after rain, the spots with the best view of approaching threats. 2 seasons ago, she had been challenged by a larger female. They had circled each other, bellowing, rearing up on their hind legs, slamming their bodies together. The fight had ended when she had driven her opponent's head into the ground and held it there until the other mother submitted. The scar on her left flank was a permanent reminder of that victory. But none of that mattered now. Now she was defending against an enemy she could not fight, her own body. The fast was destroying her. Researchers studying the fossilized bones of adult Maiasaura from Egg Mountain have identified telltale signs of chronic starvation during nesting. The bone tissue shows arrested growth lines similar to the rings in a tree, indicating periods when the body stopped all non-essential functions. Calcium was leached from the skeleton to supply the developing eggs, leaving the mother's bones brittle and prone to fracture. Some specimens show healed stress fractures on their legs, evidence that mothers continued to stand, to turn eggs, to defend their nests, even when their legs were literally cracking under their own weight. The fossil record reveals that a significant number of females died during nesting, their bodies collapsing onto their own eggs, becoming part of the mound they had spent weeks protecting. The mother at nest 43 was approaching that threshold. Her hind leg ached, deep in the femur, a dull throb that never went away. Every time she rose to turn the eggs, the pain flared. She had learned to shift her weight onto her left side, favoring the right leg, but that only increased the strain elsewhere. She was trapped in a spiral of deterioration that could only end in one of 2 ways. The eggs would hatch, or she would die. In the afternoon, the colony experienced its daily crisis. A group of 3 subadult Albertosaurus had been spotted on the ridge to the north. They were not yet full adults, but they were already 20 feet long, with jaws full of serrated teeth. They were testing the colony, watching for weakness. The alarm spread instantly through the nesting ground. A series of sharp barking calls erupted from the mothers on the north perimeter. Every head turned, every body tensed. The mother at nest 43 could not see the threat from her position, but she could feel the vibration of the other mother's calls through the ground. She pulled herself tighter around her mound, her body becoming a shield. If the Albertosaurus came down into the colony, she would not run. The eggs were everything. Her own survival was irrelevant. The subadults paced along the ridge for 20 agonizing minutes, their dark shapes silhouetted against the sky. One of them took a few steps down the slope, tongue flicking, nostrils flaring. The perimeter mothers charged, 5 of them moving in unison, their mass shaking the earth. The Albertosaurus hesitated, calculated the odds, and retreated. The colony had held, but the cost of that defense was written in the exhausted bodies of every mother who had risen to face the threat. Several of them had emptied what little energy they had left. 2 would not survive the night. As the sun began its long descent into evening, the mother at nest 43 performed the 3rd and final egg rotation of the day. Her movements were slower now, labored. She could feel the life inside the eggs, the tiny heartbeats pulsing against the sensitive skin of her foot. They were close. The embryos were fully formed now, their bones mineralized, their skin pigmented, their eyes sealed shut. In less than a week, they would begin to pip. She would hear the first cracks, the first faint cheeping sounds, and then the real work would begin. Because hatchling Maiasaura were utterly helpless. Their legs were too weak to support them. Their teeth, though present, showed microscopic wear patterns that proved they could not forage on their own. They depended entirely on the mother to bring them food, soft vegetation that she would chew into a pulp and regurgitate into the nest. She would have to make dozens of trips every day to feed them, while still not eating enough herself to recover. Mothers that successfully hatched their eggs often died in the weeks that followed, their bodies finally giving out after the marathon of incubation. But there was something else driving these mothers, something beyond pure instinct. Recent research on the fossilized brains of hadrosaurs has revealed an olfactory bulb that was proportionally larger than that of almost any modern reptile. These animals lived in a world of smell. They could recognize individual colony members by scent. They could detect the health of eggs by the odors they released, and they could likely recognize their own offspring. That maternal bond, chemically mediated, was the invisible thread that held the colony together. It would have made the death of a hatchling not just a reproductive failure, but a genuine loss, a grief as real as anything we might recognize. Yet the colony was doomed. Even as the mother at nest 43 lay her head down for another sleepless night, forces were building that would make all her sacrifices meaningless. The Deccan Traps, a volcanic province on the other side of the world, had begun to stir. For tens of thousands of years, the ground in what is now India had been cracking open, releasing vast floods of basalt and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The climate was shifting, the familiar seasonal rhythms beginning to break, and in the rock layers just above the highest nest at Egg Mountain, there are no eggs, no hatchlings, no mothers. There is only a dark band of iridium, the fingerprint of an asteroid. But before we get to that moment of cosmic annihilation, we need to look at what happened to the Maiasaura mothers who tried to adapt. Because some of them did. They fled the traditional nesting grounds and headed north toward the Arctic Circle. And what they found there was a world where the sun disappeared for months at a time, and the rules of motherhood had to be rewritten entirely. The question is, did they succeed? Or did the darkness swallow them whole? The Arctic was not supposed to be a nursery. 70 million years ago, the north slope of Alaska sat at a latitude of 85 degrees, nearly at the pole. The winters were not just cold, they were black. For 4 months out of every year, the sun never rose. The temperature dropped below freezing. Snow dusted the ferns. The ancient conifers sagged under frost. No modern reptile would survive this, let alone breed here. Yet the fossils tell a different story. Along the banks of the Colville River, in a formation known as Prince Creek, paleontologists have found the bones of thousands of hadrosaurs, including juveniles barely larger than a house cat. There are eggshell fragments in the sediment. There are tiny teeth with the same wear patterns as the Maiasaura nestlings of Montana. Dinosaurs nested here. Dinosaurs raised their young here. And they did it in a world of permanent darkness for months at a time. The species that colonized this frozen frontier was called Ugrunaluk, a name that means ancient grazer in the indigenous Inupiat language. It was a close cousin of Maiasaura, another duck-billed hadrosaur, but its body was different. The bones were denser, the nasal passages more elaborate, capable of warming frigid air before it hit the lungs. The eyes were larger, adapted to low light. The young grew faster than their Montana relatives, racing against the short polar summer to reach a size that could survive the winter. Every adaptation spoke of desperation and ingenuity. But the most remarkable thing about Ugrunaluk was that it nested at all. Because the polar environment broke every rule of the Cretaceous maternal playbook. The first rule to fall apart was the incubation strategy. In Montana, Maiasaura relied on microbial decay in their mound nests to generate heat. But in the Arctic, the permafrost was never far below the surface. The ground itself leached warmth from any organic pile. To get a mound to 33 degrees Celsius in an environment where the ambient temperature hovered just above freezing for weeks on end required an engineering miracle. The mothers had to build the mounds deeper, pack them with more vegetation, and tend them almost constantly. The decay process in such cold conditions was sluggish, so the mothers had to supplement the heat with their own bodies. Fossil evidence from Prince Creek shows that Ugrunaluk mothers likely brooded their eggs directly, using a combination of body heat and feather-like integument to keep the clutch warm. They were not just incubators, they were living furnaces, burning their own energy reserves to fight the endless cold. The second rule that broke was the fasting schedule. In Montana, a mother could theoretically hold out for 8 weeks without food. In the Arctic, the caloric demands of staying warm were astronomical. A brooding Ugrunaluk mother could not simply fast for the entire incubation period. She would freeze to death or starve within days. Instead, the colony had to cooperate. Multiple mothers likely shared nest-guarding duties, with some individuals taking turns foraging while others brooded. This meant that the rigid territoriality of Egg Mountain had to soften. The nests could not be spaced 7 meters apart if the mothers needed to huddle for warmth. The colony at Prince Creek was denser, more communal, a huddle of massive bodies pressing together against the wind. The old rule of killing unrelated juveniles probably still held, but the boundaries were blurred by necessity. But the most terrifying rule that the Arctic rewrote was the 90-minute abandonment limit. In a Montana summer, a mother could dash to the nearest stream and be back before a troodontid noticed. In the Arctic winter, there was no water to dash to. Streams froze solid. The only available water was snow, which had to be melted in the mouth, a slow and inefficient process. Leaving the nest for even half an hour in a blizzard could be fatal, not just for the eggs, but for the mother herself. Predators were fewer in the polar regions, but they were still present. A small tyrannosaur called Nanoxaurus, the polar bear lizard, hunted the darkness. It was smaller than its southern relatives, about half the size of a Tyrannosaurus rex, but it was fast, insulated with feathers, and perfectly adapted to a world of shadow and snow. A brooding Ugrunaluk mother had to keep one eye on her nest and the other on the white horizon, watching for the flicker of motion that might signal a Nanoxaurus hunting party. The question that haunted paleontologists for decades was simple. Why? Why would a dinosaur that evolved in the warm floodplains of Montana push north into an environment that was so drastically hostile? The answer, when it finally came from the geological record, was chilling. They were running from something. The northern migration was not a choice, it was an escape. Throughout the late Cretaceous, the climate of the lower latitudes was deteriorating. The Deccan traps in India had begun their long eruption cycle, belching sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The global temperature was seesawing. Ocean currents were shifting. The interior seaway that had once moderated the climate of western North America was retreating, replaced by arid plains and seasonal droughts. The lush ferns that Maiasaura depended on were dying back. The established nesting colonies were becoming death traps. Egg Mountain itself shows evidence of nesting site abandonment in the final years before the extinction. The uppermost layers of the fossilized colony contain fewer nests, smaller clutches, and a higher proportion of broken shells with no matching adult skeletons nearby. Something was already wrong before the asteroid hit. The northern hadrosaurs, the Ugrunaluk, were refugees. They had followed the retreating vegetation north, generation by generation, until they reached the Arctic coast. There they found a strange kind of refuge. The polar summers, though short, were explosively productive. 24 hours of continuous sunlight fueled a burst of plant growth that could support large herds. The long winter darkness was survivable if you could find enough bark, ferns, and moss to scrape through the frozen months. And the isolation meant fewer competitors, fewer large predators, a place where a mother could nest in relative peace if she could solve the problem of the cold. For a time, it worked. The Prince Creek fossils show that Ugrunaluk survived in the Arctic for millions of years through multiple glacial cycles. They had cracked the code, but then the code broke in a way that no mother, no matter how devoted, could fix. The asteroid came on a Tuesday. That is a joke, because there were no Tuesdays in the Cretaceous, but whatever day it was, it started like any other. The mother at a nest somewhere in the world, perhaps in Montana, perhaps in Alaska, perhaps in the Gobi Desert, was tending her eggs. She had turned them that morning. She had checked the temperature of the mound. She had hissed at a wandering juvenile. She was tired, hungry, and completely unaware that 66 million years later, scientists would argue about her final moments. The asteroid, a rock roughly 6 miles wide, entered the atmosphere at a speed of about 12 miles per second. It struck the Yucatan Peninsula at an angle that maximized destruction, vaporizing billions of tons of rock and blasting a cloud of superheated debris into the upper atmosphere. The impact site is now called Chicxulub, and the crater it left is over 90 miles across. The effect on the nesting colonies was not a single event. It was a cascade of horrors that unfolded over hours, days, and years. The first thing that hit Egg Mountain, thousands of miles from the impact, was the sound. A shockwave that traveled faster than the wind, a sonic boom that would have been felt as much as heard. The mothers would have looked up, their bodies flooding with adrenaline as the sky flashed with an impossible light. Then the ground shook. Seismic waves rippled through the continent, knocking over trees, collapsing riverbanks, shaking the mound nests so violently that eggs cracked and shattered. The mother at nest 43 would have thrown her body over her remaining eggs, trying to shield them from a threat she could not comprehend. Within hours, the ejecta began to fall. Tiny glass spheres called tektites, formed from molten rock thrown into space, rained down across the hemisphere. They were hot enough to ignite vegetation on contact. Fires swept through the forests. The sky turned black with soot and ash. The sunlight that reached the surface was dim and red, like a permanent sunset. Photosynthesis ground to a halt. The vegetation that Maiasaura and Ugrunaluk depended on began to die within days. The mothers, already starving from the fast, now faced a world with no food and no sun. The temperature plummeted. The impact winter lasted for years, perhaps a decade. In Montana, the once warm nesting grounds were buried under ash and frozen mud. In the Arctic, the darkness was already familiar, but now it was accompanied by acid rain that burned the ferns and poisoned the streams. The mother Ugrunaluk, huddled on her nest in the polar night, would have felt her eggs growing cold, no matter how tightly she pressed against them. The microbial heat in the mound, already weak in the Arctic, faded to nothing. The embryos inside the eggs stopped moving. One by one, across the colony, the tiny heartbeats that had pulsed against sensitive feet fell silent. The fossil record of the extinction is brutal and brief. At the top of the Egg Mountain sequence, there is a layer of sediment barely a few inches thick that contains no fossils of Maiasaura at all. No eggs, no hatchlings, no mothers. Below that layer, there are nests. Above it, nothing. The same pattern repeats at sites around the world. The hadrosaurs simply vanish from the rock record. In Mongolia, the Sitipati nests tell a similar story. One horizon of sediment contains brooding mothers frozen in their protective postures. The next horizon contains only the iridium dust from the asteroid impact. The mothers died on their eggs, and then their entire species was erased. But here is the thing that makes this extinction different from every other mass dying in Earth's history. The dinosaurs did not just die, they were specifically targeted. The asteroid impact and the Deccan Traps volcanism created conditions that were uniquely devastating for large-bodied, egg-laying animals with complex parental behaviors. The starvation that mothers endured during nesting made them particularly vulnerable. An animal that loses 40% of its body weight during incubation cannot survive a sudden collapse of the food web. The brooding behavior that had protected eggs for millions of years became a trap. The mothers would not abandon their nests, even as the world ended around them. The Sitipati fossils that show mothers still covering their eggs, their bodies flattened by sandstorms that came after the impact, are not just fossils. They are monuments to a loyalty that evolution could not save. And yet, something survived. Because when you look at the birds that exist today, you see the remnants of this Cretaceous maternal code. The brooding posture, the careful egg turning, the obsessive nest guarding, it all survived the extinction in the small, feathered theropods that were the ancestors of modern birds. But the code was diminished. No modern bird fasts for 8 weeks to incubate its eggs. No modern bird spaces its nests exactly 7 meters apart on pain of infanticide. No modern bird loses nearly half its body weight to keep its clutch warm. The full, brutal version of the Cretaceous maternal program was lost. What remains is a shadow, a lighter, safer protocol that was all the survivors could afford to retain. The question that drives the final act is this: what was the crucial difference? Why did some mothers survive when millions of others perished? The answer lies in a series of decisions made not by the mothers themselves, but by evolution in the millions of years before the asteroid. It is a story of size, of metabolism, of the delicate balance between devotion and survival. And it begins with a single egg, laid in a nest that was not a mound, not a fortress, but something far more adaptable. Something that could ride out the apocalypse. The mothers of the Cretaceous gave everything, their bodies, their strength, their lives. In the end, it was not enough. But what they left behind, in the bones and the eggshells and the silent nests frozen in stone, is a record of the most demanding maternal contract nature has ever written. And breaking that contract, we now know, was never a choice. It was an inevitability written in the stars. On the morning the asteroid struck, a small feathered dinosaur named Anzu was sitting on a nest in the Hell Creek Formation of what is now South Dakota. She was about the size of a cassowary, 6 feet tall, with a toothless beak and long, powerful legs. Her eggs were oval, blue-green, and she had spent the past 2 weeks pressing them against a bare patch of skin on her belly, a brood patch full of blood vessels that transferred her body heat directly into the shells. She did not rely on rotting vegetation. She did not starve herself. She left the nest multiple times a day to drink, to catch small lizards, to bite at cycad fruits. Her eggs were fewer in number than a Maiasaur's clutch, only a dozen, but they needed less maintenance. She could afford to abandon them if a predator came too close, because she could always lay more. In the brutally simple terms of natural selection, Anzu was a mother built for a world on the edge of collapse, and that made all the difference. The distinction is easy to miss when you are staring at a museum mount. Anzu was a theropod, a member of the same group that included the mighty Tyrannosaurus rex and the brooding Sitipati, but Anzu belonged to a subgroup called Oviraptorosaurs, close cousins of the birds. Her entire body plan was optimized for efficiency. Lightweight bones, a high metabolic rate, a short incubation period, and a parenting strategy that balanced risk and investment. Unlike Maiasaura, who poured everything into a single massive clutch and then defended it to the death, Anzu and her relatives hedged their bets. They laid smaller clutches more frequently. They incubated with their own body heat, a more precise temperature control that allowed them to nest in a wider variety of environments. They could move the nest if conditions deteriorated, carrying eggs in their mouths or pushing them with their snouts. They were not saints. They were survivors. The fossil record of the extinction boundary at Hell Creek tells a story that is both devastating and hopeful. In the layers below the iridium anomaly, the remains of Anzu are rare but present. In the layers just above, there are no non-avian dinosaurs of any kind. But that absence is not the whole story. The birds that survived the extinction, the ancestors of every sparrow, every eagle, every penguin alive today, were direct descendants of small theropods like Anzu. They carried forward a stripped-down version of the Cretaceous maternal code. And when you compare the nesting behavior of modern birds to the fossils of Egg Mountain, you can see exactly what was kept and what was discarded. The 7-meter rule did not make the cut. The 8-week fast was abandoned. The murder of unrelated juveniles, though it persists in some colonial seabirds, became the exception rather than the rule. What survived was the core package: brooding with body heat, egg turning, and a nest fidelity that could be dialed up or down depending on the environment. The extreme, all-or-nothing maternal contract of the Cretaceous died with the hadrosaurs and the large oviraptorids. What remained was flexibility. But here is where the story takes a turn that most documentaries will not tell you. The Maiasaura mothers were not just victims of the extinction. They were architects of their own demise, in a way that is both tragic and deeply instructive for any species, including our own, that invests heavily in its young. The very behaviors that made them so successful for tens of millions of years became an evolutionary trap when conditions changed rapidly. A mother that will not abandon her nest even as the food vanishes, even as the sky blackens, even as her own body fails, is a mother that dooms her entire genetic line. The Citipati fossils that show mothers still in brooding posture, their feathered arms wrapped around eggs that had already gone cold, are not just beautiful. They are a warning. To understand how this trap worked, you have to look at what happened to the hatchlings that did survive the first days after the asteroid. The impact winter was not a uniform blanket of cold. Near the equator, temperatures dropped less drastically. In some isolated valleys, perhaps in what is now New Zealand or parts of Antarctica that were then ice-free, pockets of vegetation survived. Small dinosaurs, those that needed less food and could generate their own body heat, had a chance. But a Maiasaura hatchling, even one that had fledged successfully, required years of growth before it could reproduce. During those years, it needed enormous quantities of plant matter. It needed a functioning social herd. It needed a colony to return to for its own future nesting. Every part of that life cycle collapsed in the aftermath. Even if a few individual mothers survived, the system that supported them was gone. The forests that provided ferns for nesting mounds had burned. The inland sea that moderated the climate had retreated. The other members of the colony were dead. A mother with no colony is a mother with no future. This is the brutal calculus of extinction. It is not about the death of individuals. It is about the collapse of an entire way of life. The Cretaceous maternal code worked beautifully in a stable world of predictable seasons, abundant vegetation, and manageable predators. It was a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering honed over millions of years. But stability is an illusion. The Earth's history is punctuated by moments when the rules change overnight, and in those moments, the most specialized, the most devoted, the most perfectly adapted are often the first to fall. There is one more layer to this story, one that researchers at a dig site in Argentina only uncovered in the last decade. It involves a dinosaur that did not follow the rules at all, a species that broke every maternal code in the Cretaceous playbook and, in doing so, may have pointed the way toward the survival strategies of the modern world. The dinosaur was called Saltosaurus, the titanosaur from the late Cretaceous of Patagonia. It was enormous, up to 40 feet long and weighing 10 tons. And its nesting strategy was so radically different from Maiasaura that when the first nests were discovered in 1997, paleontologists argued for years about what they were seeing. Saltosaurus did not build mound nests. It did not brood. It did not space its colonies at precise intervals. Instead, hundreds of Saltosaurus mothers gathered in vast nesting grounds near riverbanks and, using their hind feet, dug individual holes in the sand. Each hole was about 2 feet deep. Each mother laid a clutch of roughly 25 eggs, covered them with sand and vegetation, and then walked away. There was no fasting, no guarding, no egg turning. The eggs were incubated by solar heat and, possibly, the ambient warmth of the volcanic soil. The mothers did not return. The hatchlings clawed their way to the surface on their own, fully formed and capable of walking within hours. They emerged like sea turtles, in a swarm, moving toward the nearest cover. Most were eaten by predators within the first week, but enough survived, year after year, to keep the species alive. Saltosaurus had cracked a different code entirely. It was a mother that invested in numbers, not in individual care. And at the end of the Cretaceous, that strategy did not save them either. No titanosaur survived the asteroid. But the strategy they represented, the low-investment, high-volume approach, is alive and well in many reptiles today. From crocodiles to iguanas, the real lesson of the Cretaceous mothers is not that one strategy is better than another. It is that every maternal contract is a gamble. Maiasaura bet everything on devotion. Sittipati bet everything on endurance. Ugrunaluk bet everything on cooperation. Saltosaurus bet everything on chance. None of them could have predicted the asteroid. None of them could have prepared for a world that changed as fast as the one that arrived on that Tuesday 66 million years ago. And yet, in the end, the winners were not the strongest, or the most devoted, or the most numerous. The winners were the ones who could adapt the fastest. The small theropods, the Anzus of the world, who could sit on a nest one day and flee the next, who could incubate with body heat but also abandon a clutch if survival demanded it. They were not the best mothers by Cretaceous standards. They were the most flexible mothers, and that flexibility is written into every bird alive today. When you see a robin sitting on her nest in a suburban maple tree, you are seeing a direct descendant of the extinction survivors. She turns her eggs several times a day, just as Maiasaura did. She broods them with her body heat, just as Sittipati did. But she does not fast for 8 weeks. She does not murder her neighbor's chicks. She does not die on the nest when a hawk appears. She flies and she lives to try again. Her maternal code is a softer, gentler version of the Cretaceous original. It is a code that can bend without breaking. And that, in the end, is the single most important rule that any mother, human or dinosaur, can ever follow. Be willing to abandon the nest if the nest is no longer safe, because a mother who survives can always lay another egg. A mother who dies for her rules takes those rules with her into the void. The nests at Egg Mountain are still there today. You can visit them, walk the hillside where the first Maiasaura colony was discovered, and see the fossilized mounds still spaced at their precise 23-foot intervals. The eggs are silent. The mothers are gone. But the code they wrote in their bones, the brutal, beautiful, self-destructive code of Cretaceous motherhood, is not gone. It is in every bird that flies, every reptile that digs, every creature that sits on a nest and waits for life to emerge. The asteroid did not end motherhood. It just rewrote the rules. The nests at Egg Mountain are not silent. Not if you know how to listen. When the wind moves across the Montana hillside in late summer, it hisses through the same grasses that grew from soil enriched by 77 million years of decay. The ground under your feet is made of eggshells. The dust that clings to your boots contains microscopic fragments of hadrosaur bone. The colony is still there, compressed into the rock, waiting for someone to read it. And what it says, if you listen carefully, is that motherhood is not a feeling. It is a system, a set of rules that a species either follows or it dies. The Maiasaura mothers followed those rules with a precision that modern humans might find almost religious. 7 meters, 33 degrees, 3 turns a day, 90 minutes. They did not write these numbers down. They did not teach them to their young. They simply lived them, generation after generation, until the numbers were stitched into their DNA. And for tens of millions of years, it worked. The hadrosaurs spread across continents. They became one of the most successful dinosaur groups in the fossil record. Their colonies were the engine of their survival, churning out thousands of new individuals every season, feeding the herds that darkened the Cretaceous plains. But the engine had a flaw. It was too rigid. When the asteroid struck, and the world turned dark, and the ferns stopped growing, the mothers could not rewrite the code. They stayed on their nests. They starved. They died, and the code died with them. The tragedy of Maiasaura is not that they were weak, it is that they were too strong, too committed, too perfectly adapted to a world that no longer existed. That is the quiet danger that waits at the end of every evolutionary success story. The better you are at surviving in one particular world, the harder it is to survive when that world suddenly vanishes. But this is not just a story about dinosaurs. It is a story about the cost of devotion. Every mother in the animal kingdom faces a version of the same calculation that the Cretaceous mothers faced. How much of my own body do I give? How long do I stay? At what point does protecting my young become a threat to my own survival? The Maiasaura answered those questions with an all-in bet. The birds answered with a hedge. And both answers, in different ways, were right. The Maiasaura dominated the Cretaceous for millions of years. The birds survived the apocalypse and inherited the earth. There is no single correct way to be a mother. There is only the way that works until it doesn't. Consider the modern elephant. A female elephant carries her calf for 22 months, the longest gestation of any land mammal. She nurses that calf for 2 years and continues to protect it for a decade. She is, by any measure, one of the most devoted mothers on the planet. But elephant populations are collapsing. Poaching, habitat loss, climate change. The very devotion that makes elephant herds so tight-knit also makes them vulnerable. A mother who will not leave her injured calf is a mother who gets shot herself. The parallel to the Maiasaura fast, to the Sittipati brooding posture, is unnerving. We are watching a Cretaceous-level devotion play out again in real time, and we already know how this story ends if the rules do not change. Or consider the sea turtle. Like Saltosaurus, she drags herself onto a beach, digs a hole, lays over 100 eggs, covers them, and returns to the ocean. She never meets her offspring. She never feeds them. She invests nothing but the energy to produce the eggs and bury them in sand. And sea turtles have survived for over 100 million years. They watched the dinosaurs come and go. They are still here today. But even they are struggling now. The beaches are disappearing. The sand temperatures are rising, changing the sex ratios of the hatchlings. A strategy that worked for 100 million years is suddenly failing. Because the world is changing faster than turtles can adapt. Sound familiar? The asteroid that killed the dinosaurs was not a one-time event. It was a reminder that the universe does not care about your code. It does not care about your 7 meters, or your 33 degrees, or your 90 minutes. It does not care how much weight you have lost, how many nights you have gone without sleep, how many scars you carry from defending your nest. The universe will test your rules, and if they break, you break with them. The only defense against that kind of chaos is flexibility, the willingness to abandon the nest when the nest is no longer safe, the courage to write a new code when the old one fails. The Myasora could not do that. The Siddhapati could not do that. The Ugrunaluk, for all their adaptations, could not do that. Only the small, the fast, the adaptable made it through. And that is a lesson that straddles the boundary between paleontology and something far more personal. Because every human parent who has ever stared at a baby monitor at 3 in the morning knows this tension. The urge to stay, to protect, to pour every ounce of your being into the small, fragile life you have created. And the counter-urge to survive, to preserve yourself, to remember that you are a person as well as a parent. The Cretaceous mothers could not balance those two urges. They were hardwired to choose the nest, every time, to the point of death. And in that, they were not just ancestors, they were warnings. They tell us, across 66 million years, that love without limits is a kind of suicide. That care, taken to its extreme, becomes a trap. That the best mothers are not the ones who give everything. They are the ones who give enough and survive to give again tomorrow. The fossil beds of Egg Mountain are now part of a protected area. You can hike there, if you are willing to drive the back roads of Montana, past the small town of Choteau, and walk the same hillside where Jack Horner and Bob Mekela stood in 1978. The museum in town has a few of the original fossils. The rest are in collections across the country, in museums and university basements, still being studied, still yielding secrets. Every few years, a new paper comes out that adds another detail to the picture of Cretaceous motherhood. A new isotope analysis that reveals what the mothers ate. A new CT scan that shows how the embryos developed. A new excavation that uncovers yet another layer of nests, another snapshot of a mother frozen in her final act of care. The code is still being deciphered. The rules are still being rewritten. And the question that lingers, the one that the scientists do not always say out loud, but that hangs over every fossil, every eggshell fragment, every skeleton curled around a long cold nest, is this: if the test came again, would we pass it? We, the humans, with our complex brains and our flexible cultures, and our ability to imagine the future and plan for it, could we do what the Myasora could not? Could we adapt fast enough? Or are we too bound by codes we cannot break, loyalties we cannot abandon, habits we cannot change? The Cretaceous mothers are not a distant curiosity. They are a mirror, and the reflection is not always comfortable. The sun sets over Egg Mountain in the same way it always has, give or take a few degrees of global temperature. The wind still hisses. The ground still holds its secrets. Somewhere in the world right now, a mother is sitting on a nest she will not leave, guarding eggs she may not save, following a rule book written long before she was born. Whether she is a bird, a reptile, or a mammal, she is the heir to a tradition that stretches back to the Cretaceous, a tradition of sacrifice, a tradition of precision, a tradition that, at its best, brings new life into the world and, at its worst, takes the mother with it. The Cretaceous ended, but motherhood did not. It just learned, slowly and painfully, how to bend. If you want to see more stories like this, about the hidden rules that shaped the ancient world and still echo in our own, click the video on your screen right now. It is a deep dive into the bizarre survival strategies of the Triassic, and it picks up exactly where this story leaves off. Subscribe to the channel if you are not already. And if you are watching this from somewhere in the world, drop your location in the comments and tell us what time it is where you are. I always love seeing where these stories travel. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your nest safe.